Okay, we spent some time looking at the philosophical questions around value, and the subjects that we talked about in that category were ethics, questions about what makes a good person, an evil person, a right action, a wrong action, question of justice, and under that we talked about political philosophy. Then we did not talk, but I mentioned earlier there were questions about what makes something beautiful. Some of the questions there being, you look at a piece of art. Somebody goes to, let's say, the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan, and they're looking at something and say, my God, this looks like a 3-year-old did it. And then the art critic is sitting there explaining the entire meaning of the work of art. So it leads people to question, are there objective values? Is there an objective standard against to which to measure beauty? By the way, I didn't mention it earlier, but those same questions do arise when we are talking about ethics as well. But now what I want to do is turn to the next subject, the subject of reality. And under the question of the topic of reality, we mentioned that the branch of philosophy that deals with reality is something called metaphysics, which has two branches, or at least when I got started, it had two branches, cosmology and ontology, and we'll talk about that. And we will leave knowledge for a later slide. Well, metaphysics comes from a Latin word. It sounds funny. It was invented by the Greeks, but it's a Latin word. It's because the editors of Aristotle's work came up with the term. They had been compiling, and Aristotle had written many things. He had written dialogues, or it's reported that he had written dialogues, none of them, like Plato's, none of them has survived. However, he did leave a lot of works that he wrote and some things that were sort of lecture notes. And his editor, his Roman editor, was putting this information together and putting it by subject. So he wrote on the soul, he wrote things about the categories, he wrote on various subjects. He wrote about some of the sciences, he wrote about physics, and then he had this whole volume about stuff about reality, and that stuff ended up being after the physics. So people think metaphysics, the term, has something to do with, well, you guys have seen the movie Ghostbusters, or at least have heard of it. People think of metaphysical events. It's like it has something to do with ghosts, spirits, and something else. Well, the reason they call that metaphysical kind of events has to do with philosophy, but really the term, interestingly enough, the term really came from the fact that the book that deals with these problems that Aristotle wrote was the next volume, the one that was put after the physics. And all of his volumes were compiled by the editor. But there's more to it than just the fact that it was a volume that followed after it, because when you think about it, metaphysics is the attempt to answer most fundamental questions about existence and reality. So in that regard, it's really, beyond mere physics. It's really trying to talk about what things are there. And those can be broken down into two sorts of questions. The questions of what's called cosmology, as in the cosmos, and the questions of ontology. Ontology we'll have to get a better understanding of. It doesn't pop up right in your consciousness. But cosmology is something that you guys have heard about and you've seen. It's the study of the universe as a whole. Its birth, its growth, its shape, its eventual fate, where it came from, where it's going from. In fact, you heard in the YouTube that we saw from Carl Sagan, the name of the program was Cosmos, and Carl Sagan was an astronomer and physicist, but he dealt with questions about cosmology, How did the universe get started? So it's a basic question. Where does the cosmos, why does it exist? People tell you the Big Bang got it going. Well, why did it start here rather than somewhere else, rather than at a slightly different time? And there are questions there. Why are we here? What brings us here? Is there some purpose for our being here? Where did we come from? That is, how do we, living, breathing beings, how did we come into existence? Now, cosmology has really been taken over by physicists and astronomers. So what I want you to do, or what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to put it in with the YouTubes, is take a look at this YouTube by Stephen Hawking. He does mention some of the works of some philosophers and theologians in a very negative, a very derogatory way. And I think he's not being fair to some of them. Please kind of be patient. Stephen Hawking, you might know, is he's wheelchair bound. He's suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and he speaks through a synthesizer, so the voice is going to sound funny. But sit back in your seats and listen to this, because I think it's kind of interesting. It'll give you an idea what cosmology is all about. I think based on what cosmology is, it's going to be easier for you to understand what ontology is and what problems of ontology, of metaphysics, we're going to be looking at and seeing what our ancient philosophers had to say about these particular